It's mine now, old woman. You don't need jewelry when your memory is fading. That was the sentence that ripped through the air of my own living room like a knife, delivered by my son's wife as she unclasped the necklace from my throat in front of Quiche. Everyone, her laughter echoing against the chandelier crystals. I felt the coldness of bare skin where the diamonds had rested for decades, but the greater chill was the silence that followed. The silence of my own son, who would not raise his eyes, who would not open his mouth to defend me. The rest of the family shifted in their seats, muttering half-heartedly, pretending to notice their food instead of the theft that had just occurred before their eyes. But no one told her to stop. No one insisted that what she had done was wrong. It was as if, in that instant, the years of sacrifice, the nights of working double shifts, the patient endurance of every indignity I had swallowed for the sake of providing for my child, all of it dissolved into a cruel performance where I was cast, as the powerless elder, mocked in my own house, stripped not just of jewelry, but of dignity. The necklace was no ordinary piece of gold and stone. It was a monument to decades of labor, to every hour I had worked as a nurse when my legs ached so badly that the bus ride home felt longer than a pilgrimage, to every time I had put my own dreams aside so my son could attend better schools, to every bill I paid on time while denying myself new shoes or vacations. I had bought it with my own money, not as a gift from a man, not as a hand-me-down from someone else, but as proof that I could carve out beauty in a world determined to tell black women of my generation that we were meant to scrub, serve, and settle for less. When she took it, she wasn't just stealing metal and diamonds. She was trying to erase the story that came with it. I sat, frozen, my fork still hovering over a plate I could no longer touch, and heard her laugh as she fastened the chain around her own throat. She leaned back in her chair, tilting her chin upward so that the light danced across the diamonds, and said again, "It's mine now." My son's eyes flickered toward her and then away, his cowardice cutting deeper than any insult. Around the table, the conversation resumed in hesitant bursts, as though everyone had silently agreed to pretend nothing had happened. But humiliation has a weight to it, a pulse that drums in your ears and makes it impossible to join in the laughter. I felt that weight pressing into my chest, heavier than the necklace had ever been. For a moment, I wanted to shout, to slam my hand on the table and demand that the necklace be returned, that respect be shown, that the truth be acknowledged. But my tongue was trapped by the knowledge of how they would twist the story. They had already planted whispers in the air about how sometimes I forgot details, how I repeated myself, how maybe I was getting confused in my age. It would be too easy for them to claim that I had given it to her, or worse, that I was too unstable to even remember what had truly happened. And so I stayed quiet. But inside me, something shifted. As she preened in my necklace, I thought of my mother, who scrubbed floors for white families and told me that no matter what they said, no matter how much they tried to push us down, a black woman must always find one thing in her life that was hers, alone, untouchable. The necklace had been that for me. I thought of the patients whose names I remembered long after they forgot mine, of the shifts where I held dying hands, of the long walks home past jewelry stores where I promised myself that one day I would own something fine. And now, here was this woman, who had married into my family, snatching away not just a piece of jewelry, but the proof of a promise I had kept to myself. Dinner ended eventually. Chairs scraping against the floor, murmured goodbyes covering over the ugliness that had poisoned the evening. I excused myself with quiet dignity, walked down the hall, and shut the door to my bedroom. Standing in front of the mirror, I touched the red indentation that the chain had left on my skin, and whispered words only I could hear. They think they have stolen from me. But the story is not over, because what they do not know is that the necklace carries with it a paper trail, a history written in ink, a receipt locked away in my cedar chest that proves not only ownership but sacrifice, the kind of evidence that cannot be laughed away at a dinner table. They had mocked me in public, but one day soon I would rise in public too, not with tears, but with truth sharper than diamonds. The morning after that humiliating dinner, I woke up with the kind of heaviness in my chest that does not come from sleep, but from carrying shame through the night. I made my coffee in silence, the old drip machine hissing as if it too were tired of repeating the same routine year after year. And I sat at the kitchen table staring at the steam curling from the cup, my fingers tracing the grain of the wood that had supported countless family meals, conversations, and arguments. For a moment, I convinced myself that maybe I had imagined the sharpness of her words, the smugness of her laughter, the way she claimed my necklace as if it had been hers all along. Perhaps I thought it was just a cruel joke, a moment of bad taste that she would regret in the morning. I wanted to believe that when I stepped into the living room, she would be there with an apology, that my son would look me in the eye and say he had been wrong to stay silent, that they would return what was mine. But when I turned on my phone and opened the social media app that my niece had taught me to use, the truth glared back at me with a cruelty sharper than the diamonds themselves. On the screen was a photograph of my son's wife, her head tilted in the same self-satisfied angle she had struck the night before, the necklace gleaming around her throat as if it had always belonged there. The caption under the photo read, "A gift from my loving husband, proof of his devotion." Dozens of comments flooded beneath it, friends and distant relatives posting heart emojis, congratulations, and words like stunning and queen. They had swallowed her lie whole, believing that the necklace had been purchased by my son, that it was an expression of love between a man and his wife, that it was a symbol of a future they were building together. I felt the blood rise hot in my ears as I scrolled through the praise, each line striking me as if it were mocking my silence from the night before. No one knew that the necklace was not his to give. No one knew that it had been ripped from my neck as I sat at the same table where I had served him meals since he was a boy. No one knew that the only devotion represented in those diamonds was my own devotion to years of sacrifice, labor, and survival. I set the phone down and pressed my palms against the table, steadying myself against the dizziness that comes when rage and hurt collide inside your chest. That photograph was more than a lie. It was the beginning of a rewriting of my history. If I allowed that story to stand, if I let them parade around with my necklace while telling the world it was theirs, then everything it represented for me would be erased. It was not just about the object, but about the meaning attached to it, the decades of sweat and endurance that had led me to buy it. They were trying to bury my story beneath their own, to make me invisible even in the artifacts of my life. I thought of my friends at church, women my age who carried similar scars of disrespect and erasure. I imagined them scrolling past that photo, smiling politely, believing the lie, never knowing that the woman who sat beside them in the pews each Sunday had been stripped of something sacred. I imagined my granddaughter, one day old enough to scroll through the internet and see her mother wearing that necklace, believing the false story that it was a gift from her father, and never knowing that her grandmother had purchased it with her own blood and sweat. That possibility ignited something in me. It was one thing to mock me in private, to humiliate me at a dinner table, but to broadcast that humiliation publicly, to let it seep into the archive of family memory, was something I could not allow. I went to my bedroom and opened the cedar chest that had sat at the foot of my bed for as long as I could remember. Inside, beneath folded quilts and envelopes of old photographs, was the envelope I had been saving for decades. I pulled it out with hands that trembled, not from weakness, but from fury. Inside was the original receipt from the jeweler, dated and signed, with my name written clearly across the top. The amount still shocked me even now. $2 million. At the time, I had paid it slowly, in installments that stretched across years, each month cutting back on something else, refusing myself small luxuries so that one day I could own something undeniable. The jeweler had known me by name, had smiled when I walked in each month with my payment, had congratulated me when the final installment was complete. Holding that receipt in my hands now, I felt both vindicated and betrayed. Vindicated because I knew I had proof. Betrayed because it enraged me that I even needed proof against my own family. I sat back on my bed, the envelope heavy in my lap, and thought about the path that had brought me here. All my life I had been told to be patient, to endure, to let things slide for the sake of peace. As a black woman of my generation, raised in a world that rarely saw us as worthy of anything beyond service, I had grown accustomed to swallowing my pain in silence. But as I stared at that receipt, I realized that silence would not save me this time. If I allowed their lie to spread unchecked, if I allowed that photo to remain the narrative, then silence would not be peace. It would be complicity in my own erasure. Later that day, when I confronted them in the kitchen, my voice shaking but steady enough to be heard, I demanded that the necklace be returned. My son's wife laughed, the same cruel sound that had cut me the night before, and said, "You don't even remember half the things you say. You gave it to me as a gift, don't you recall? Or is your memory failing again?" My son, standing beside her, nodded with a solemnity that made me want to scream, as though he had convinced himself of the lie, or at least convinced himself that siding with her was easier than confronting the truth. They spoke to me not as family, but as predators, circling a woman they believed was too old, too fragile, too isolated to fight back. I realized then that this was no misunderstanding, no careless joke. It was the start of a campaign to strip me not just of jewelry, but of authority, to paint me as a senile old woman unfit to make decisions, unworthy of owning what she had worked for. They wanted to gaslight me into doubting my own memory, my own history, until even I wondered if perhaps I had misremembered. But I knew better. I had the receipt. I had the memory of every dollar I had paid. I had the strength of a woman who had survived worse humiliations than this. And most of all, I had the knowledge that what they had tried to bury in laughter would one day be dragged into the light of a courtroom, where facts, not lies, would decide whose story would endure. When I confronted them in the kitchen that afternoon, with the envelope pressed firmly against my chest like a shield, I had still clung to a fragile hope that reason might break through the wall of arrogance they had built around themselves. I had imagined that when they saw the seriousness in my eyes, when they realized I was not going to accept silence or dismissal, my son might remember the woman who had raised him, the woman who had stood between him and hunger, the woman who had sacrificed her own youth to make sure he had the freedom to dream. I had pictured, if only for a fleeting moment, that he would put his hand on his wife's shoulder, take the necklace from her throat, and hand it back to me with an apology. But what met me instead was a wall of cruelty, calculated and deliberate, a performance so rehearsed it became clear that this was not a sudden impulse, but a strategy, a decision they had made together to erase me. She leaned against the counter, the necklace glittering mockingly against her chest, and with a smile that could have cut glass, she said, "You're confused again. We already talked about this. You gave it to me. You said it was time for the younger generation to carry things forward." Her words were honeyed but laced with venom, spoken slowly as though she were trying to convince not just me, but herself, as if repetition could transform a lie into truth. My son, standing a step behind her, did not hesitate to nod in agreement. "Mum," he said, in a voice so carefully measured it reminded me of a lawyer presenting closing arguments. "You really don't remember? It was right after dinner. You were smiling, and you said you wanted her to have it. You wanted to bless our marriage with something special." For a moment, the room seemed to tilt around me. The audacity of their lie, spoken with such composure, made me feel as though I had been pushed into another reality, one where facts could be rewritten at will, where memory itself could be twisted until I doubted my own sanity. I tightened my grip on the envelope, feeling the edge of the paper bite into my palm, and forced myself to breathe. "No," I said slowly, refusing to let them rush me into confusion. "I did not give it to you. You ripped it off my neck. You humiliated me in front of this family. And I have proof." I laid the receipt on the counter, the paper trembling slightly from the tension in my hand. But the ink was steady and undeniable. My name, the date, the jeweller's seal, and the price. The silence that followed was not the silence of shame or surrender, but of calculation. My daughter-in-law tilted her head, her eyes narrowing with a gleam of triumph rather than fear. She tapped the paper with her manicured nail and said, "So you have a receipt?" "That doesn't mean anything now. You said yourself you bought it 30 years ago. People give things away. People change their minds. And frankly, if you want to drag this into court, who do you think they'll believe? An old woman who forgets what day it is? Or a married couple starting a life together?" The cruelty of her words landed like a slap. But what cut deeper was the way my son stood there nodding, as though every syllable she spoke were gospel. He had once been the boy who ran home from school, clutching bruises and tears. And I had told him to stand tall, that the world would always try to knock him down, but he must not let anyone redefine who he was. Now here he stood, using those same tactics against me, trying to redefine me as unstable, unreliable, unworthy of trust. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Mum, maybe it's time you faced reality. You're not as sharp as you used to be. You forget things. You repeat stories. Sometimes you don't even lock the front door. We're just trying to take care of you. Maybe this obsession with the necklace is a sign that you need help." The words struck harder than any fist could. My own son, the child I had carried through nights of fever, the young man I had celebrated at every milestone, was now standing in front of me, declaring that I was not competent to speak for myself. My mouth went dry as the implications settled in. They were not simply trying to steal a necklace. They were trying to build a case for control, to paint me as a woman who could not handle her own affairs, who needed guardianship, who could be stripped of her independence under the guise of care. It was a familiar story, one I had seen unfold in other families, whispered about in church basements and community gatherings. Children who decided that their aging parents were too inconvenient, too expensive, too stubborn, and so they rebranded love into control, turned concern into legal power, and seized what was not theirs in the name of protection. I straightened my back, refusing to let them see the tremor that ran through my body. "You will not take my history from me," I said, my voice low but firm. "I know what I bought. I know what you stole. And if you think you can rewrite the truth by repeating lies, you're mistaken." For the first time, I saw a flicker of unease in my son's eyes, but it was gone in an instant, swallowed by the determination in his wife's smirk. She stepped closer, lowering her voice to a whisper meant to slice directly into me. "Do you really want to go public with this? Do Do you want the whole world to see you standing in a courtroom, confused, stumbling over your words, while people whisper about how tragic it is that you've lost your mind? We're trying to protect you from yourself. It was then I understood fully the escalation I was facing. This was no longer about a necklace. It was about power, about control, about silencing me before I could gather the strength to fight back. They wanted me to retreat, to shrink, to second-guess myself until I handed them not just the necklace, but my entire legacy. And for a moment, I admit, fear rose in me like a tide. I imagined standing in a courtroom, the eyes of strangers on me, their whispers confirming the very lies my son and his wife had crafted, and the thought made my knees weaken. But just as quickly as the fear came, it was replaced by something else, an ember of defiance that had burned in me since the day I learned that survival for a black woman in this country meant not only enduring, but refusing to let others dictate your worth. I gathered the receipt and pressed it back into the envelope, holding it against my chest once more, and I said with a steadiness that surprised even me, "If it takes a courtroom to prove the truth, then so be it. I will not let you bury me before I'm gone." My son opened his mouth to respond, but I raised my hand to silence him. "You may have forgotten who I am," I said, "but I haven't, and when the day comes, neither will anyone else." That night, I sat at my kitchen table again, the envelope resting beside me like a companion, and I began to write down everything I remembered in a notebook. The day I bought the necklace, the installments I paid, the words spoken at the dinner table, the photographs I had seen online, the confrontation in the kitchen. I knew that if they were willing to twist the truth so boldly, I would need more than memory to stand against them. I would need records, witnesses, evidence. The first escalation had begun, and though they thought they could weaken me with doubt, they had only awakened the part of me that had always known how to fight. The weeks that followed the confrontation in the kitchen became a blur of quiet defiance and careful preparation, a period where I forced myself to move slowly, deliberately, as though I were balancing a glass of water on my head, because one wrong step would give them the opening they were waiting for. I could see it in the way my son's wife watched me, her eyes scanning for any slip of the tongue, any hesitation, any misplaced object that she could later frame as proof that I was losing my mind. She had grown bolder, walking around the house with the necklace glittering at her throat, flaunting it in front of me as if daring me to snatch it back, her laughter echoing in the hallways whenever she caught me staring. My son was more subtle, masking his betrayal under the guise of concern, asking me gently whether I had remembered to take my vitamins, whether I had misplaced the electricity bill, whether I wanted him to handle my finances just to make life easier. I answered each question with calm precision, refusing to give them any ammunition, but inside I carried a storm of rage that threatened to break me apart. One evening, after another tense dinner where the necklace sparkled like a weapon across the table, I went into my bedroom, locked the door, and sat on the edge of my bed, holding the receipt in my hands. I knew that paper alone was not enough. They could twist it, minimize it, claim it meant nothing. If this fight was going to reach a courtroom, I needed more than my word against theirs. I needed someone who could stand beside me, someone whose authority could not be so easily dismissed. That was when I thought of Mr. Kaplan, the jeweler who had sold me the necklace all those years ago. He had been a younger man then, patient with me when I came each month with my envelope of cash, proud of me when I finally completed the last payment, and respectful enough to ask if I wanted my name written in full on the receipt. Something he said. Many customers never requested. I remembered his hands, steady and careful, placing the necklace in its velvet case and telling me, "This is not just jewelry. This is history you've built with your own hands. I had not spoken to him in years, but I knew his store still stood downtown, the little shop with the green awning that had survived while bigger businesses came and went. The next morning, I put on my coat, tucked the receipt carefully into my purse, and made my way to his store. The bell above the door rang the same way it had 30 years ago, a delicate chime that carried memory with it, and when Mr. Kaplan looked up from the counter, I saw in his eyes a flicker of recognition. His hair had thinned, his back had curved with age, but his presence was the same steady warmth I remembered. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, smiling slowly as though the years had folded back on themselves. "It's been a long time." I nodded, too choked up to speak at first, and when I finally found my voice, I said, "I need your help. They're trying to take what I bought, and I need you to remember." We sat together in the small office behind the showroom, surrounded by shelves of velvet boxes and old ledgers, and I laid the receipt on the desk between us. He adjusted his glasses, studied the paper carefully, and then leaned back in his chair. "I remember this," he said softly. "You were one of the few customers who insisted on everything being written properly, every installment documented, every date recorded. You said you wanted no one to ever doubt that this was yours." His words washed over me like water on parched ground, a reminder that my insistence all those years ago had not been paranoia, but foresight, the instinct of a woman who knew too well how easily her labor could be dismissed, how quickly her story could be stolen. "I can testify to this if you need me to," he continued. "I can confirm that you bought it, that it was always yours, that there was never any mention of it being passed to anyone else." For the first time since that cursed night at the dinner table, I felt the tension in my chest loosen slightly. I was no longer alone. There was someone outside my family, someone with authority and memory, who could stand in the light and say what I knew to be true. As I walked out of the shop that afternoon, the city air sharp and cold against my face, I felt a shift inside me. This was no longer a private family dispute whispered behind closed doors. It was becoming a matter of record, of testimony, of evidence that could stand in a courtroom. And with that realization came both relief and fear, because I knew that once the fight reached that stage, there would be no turning back. In the days that followed, I began to prepare myself as though for a battle. I wrote down every conversation, every insult, every time they tried to twist my words or undermine my memory. I gathered documents from my bank, showing the withdrawals I had made during those years to pay for the necklace. I even went through old boxes of letters and receipts, piecing together a timeline that proved not only the purchase, but the intent. That this necklace had always been mine, and that I had safeguarded it with the hope of one day passing it down on my own terms. At church, though I said nothing directly, I began to listen more carefully to the prayers of the women around me, the subtle ways they spoke of children who had turned cold, of property disputes, of betrayals too painful to name aloud. Their voices became a chorus in my ears, reminding me that I was not the only one carrying such a burden, that the struggle to hold on to dignity in old age was a struggle shared by many. The midpoint of this battle came one Sunday afternoon, when my son and his wife confronted me in the living room with an ultimatum. She wore the necklace proudly, her fingers brushing over the diamonds as though stroking a pet, and he stood beside her with a document in his hands. "Mom," he said, with a solemnity that would have been touching if it weren't so venomous, "we've been talking, and we think it's best for you to sign this. It's just a simple statement, confirming that you gifted the necklace to us. That way there's no confusion, no embarrassment, no need for things to get ugly." I took the paper from him, read the lines that had been crafted with cold precision, and felt my stomach turn. It was a lie written in legal language, a trap designed to silence me permanently. I looked up at him and said, "You want me to sign away my truth?" He flinched at the sharpness in my voice, but his wife only smirked, crossing her arms as though she had already won. That was the moment everything crystallized for me. There would be no reconciliation, no quiet resolution within these walls. They had escalated the fight into legal territory, and now it was my turn to respond in kind. I stood, tore the paper cleanly down the middle, and let the pieces fall to the floor between us. "If you want this to be decided on paper," I said, my voice rising with the weight of decades, "then we will take it to court. And when we do, you will see that the truth has longer legs than any lie you can craft." The look on my son's face was one of panic, quickly masked by anger, but I caught it in that fleeting second, and it gave me strength. He knew, deep down, that his foundation was built on sand. That night, after they stormed out muttering threats about lawyers and guardianship, I sat once again at my kitchen table, the receipt beside me, my notebook open, and I whispered a prayer into the stillness. Not a prayer for revenge, but for endurance, for clarity, for the strength to see this fight through without breaking. I thought of the young lawyer at church, a woman in her 30s who had once told me she specialized in elder law, and I resolved to call her in the morning. I thought of Mr. Kaplan's steady voice, promising to testify, and I thought of my granddaughter, the innocent child who one day would inherit not just possessions, but stories. And I vowed that when she grew old enough to ask where the necklace came from, she would hear the truth, not a lie built on arrogance. And theft. The midpoint of a story is often the place where the protagonist chooses a path from which there is no return. As I closed my notebook and laid my head on the table, I knew I had reached that place. The necklace was no longer just jewelry. It had become a battleground for memory, respect, and dignity. And no matter how long the fight stretched, no matter how sharp the insults became, no matter how lonely the nights felt, I would not surrender. Because this was not only about me. It was about every woman who had ever been told she was too old, too confused, too powerless to defend what was hers. And as long as I had breath, I would not let that lie stand. The letter arrived on a Wednesday morning, tucked inside a plain white envelope with the bold heading of a local law firm printed across the top. I had been standing at the kitchen counter, sorting through the usual stack of bills and grocery flyers, when the sight of that name froze me in place. My hands trembled slightly as I slid my finger under the seal and pulled out the folded sheets inside. At first, the legal jargon blurred together, all whereas and therefore. But then the meaning cut through with brutal clarity. My son and his wife had filed a petition in court, not simply to claim ownership of the necklace, but to declare me legally incompetent. They were not just trying to steal a piece of jewelry anymore. They were trying to erase me as a decision-maker in my own life, to put every dollar, every possession, and every choice under their control. I sank into the chair, the paper rattling in my grip, and felt the air leave my lungs as though I had been struck. The audacity of it left me momentarily speechless. They had decided that humiliating me in private was not enough. They wanted to drag me into a courtroom, parade me in front of strangers, and argue that I was a confused old woman who no longer had the right to handle her own affairs. Every line of the petition was laced with half-truths and twisted exaggerations. Mentions of times I had repeated myself in conversation, notes about bills that had arrived late, vague claims that I was easily manipulated and needed their guidance. They had even included the lie about the necklace, stating in cold black ink that I had given it to her as a gift, and that I was now confused about what had actually happened. Reading those words, signed by my own son, was like watching him slam a door on the life we had shared, on the bond I had once believed unbreakable. In the days that followed, the whispers began. At church, I noticed heads turning when I walked into the sanctuary. A neighbour who had once greeted me warmly now looked away, her face tight with discomfort. The news had spread quickly. My own son accusing me of losing my mind, dragging me into court like a burden to be managed rather than a mother to be honoured. Shame and anger twisted together in my chest, each breath heavy with the knowledge that their plan was working. They wanted to isolate me, to paint me as unstable, to strip away the support of the community before I even had a chance to speak. I refused to crumble, but the weight of their betrayal pressed against me every moment. One night, I sat at my kitchen table, the court papers spread out before me, and thought of the decades I had given to my son. I remembered the long hours at the hospital, the nights I came home bone-tired but still managed to cook him dinner, the birthdays I stretched every dollar to make special, the college tuition I paid for with savings I could barely afford to part with. I remembered the boy who once clung to me when thunderstorms rattled the windows, who whispered that he wanted to grow up to make me proud. Now that boy was gone, replaced by a man who stood beside his wife and signed papers that sought to declare me incapable of even knowing my own mind. That transformation was more painful than any insult, because it told me that the love I had poured into him had not been enough to anchor him against greed. As the court date drew closer, my fear grew, but so did my determination. I had already spoken with the young lawyer from church, a sharp-minded black woman who listened with both compassion and steel in her eyes as I laid out the story. She told me plainly that cases like this were not uncommon, that children and in-laws sometimes sought guardianship as a way to gain control of assets, but she assured me that evidence mattered. "You are not powerless," she said, tapping the receipt I had brought to her. "You have documentation, you have witnesses, and you have the truth. They may try to smear you, but they cannot erase what is real." Her words gave me a steadiness I had been craving, a reminder that I was not walking into this fight alone. Still, the nights were long and restless. I often lay awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining the courtroom, imagining the eyes of strangers watching me, waiting for me to stumble, to forget, to prove the lie they wanted to brand me with. I imagined my son sitting across from me, his expression cold and distant, his wife's smirk fixed in place. And I wondered how he could do it, how the child I had raised could be so willing to destroy me for the sake of possessions. It was an injustice so sharp it made my stomach twist, because I knew that no matter the outcome, something between us had been shattered beyond repair. The day before the hearing, I walked to the park where I used to take him as a boy. The playground was empty, the swings creaking in the breeze, and I sat on the same bench where I had once watched him climb and tumble and laugh. Tears burned in my eyes as I whispered to myself that I was not crazy, that I was not confused, that the truth lived in my bones, even if they tried to write it out of existence. In that quiet moment, I promised myself that no matter how cruel the lies became, I would not break. They might try to turn the world against me, but I would stand tall, because this was bigger than a necklace, bigger than property, bigger even than betrayal. This was about the right to hold on to my story, to refuse to let it be stolen or rewritten, to make sure that when my granddaughter grew old enough to understand, she would know that her grandmother fought and did not bow down. The morning of the first hearing arrived with a sky the colour of steel, the kind of heavy grey that presses down on you before a storm, and I felt the weight of it settle on my shoulders as I dressed carefully, choosing a navy blue dress that I had worn to church on Easter the year before. I wanted to look dignified, not flashy, and certainly not fragile. As I buttoned the collar and smoothed the fabric across my chest, I reminded myself that this was no longer about a family squabble, but about a battle over truth. And if they wanted to drag me into a courtroom to call me incompetent, then I would. Make sure every person in that room saw a woman who carried herself with dignity and clarity. My lawyer, Ms. Parker, had told me to bring the original receipt, my notes, and any additional documents that showed a pattern of responsibility. I had spent the nights leading up to this day gathering bank statements, utility bills paid on time, even the meticulous grocery lists I kept in a notebook, anything that would undermine their claims that I was confused or incapable. It felt strange, almost humiliating, to gather proof that I could still manage my life. But I understood that humiliation was the currency they were trying to spend against me, and I refused to let them profit from it. When I entered the courthouse, the echo of my footsteps seemed too loud against the marble floor, and for a brief moment I felt as if every eye in the building turned toward me, weighing me against the accusations that had been written in black ink. My son and his wife were already there, seated side by side in the hallway, their clothes sharp and expensive, their posture radiating confidence. She wore the necklace deliberately, openly, as though to taunt me with its shimmer under the fluorescent lights. He looked at me once, his eyes flat and unreadable, then turned away as though I were a stranger. The betrayal still stung, a raw wound that refused to close, but I forced myself to lift my chin, to walk past them without faltering, to show them that I was not beaten yet. Inside the courtroom, the air felt tight, heavy, with the tension of unspoken judgments. Their lawyer, a tall man with a slick voice and a rehearsed smile, stood to speak first. He painted a picture of me as a woman adrift, clinging to possessions out of confusion, struggling with memory lapses, incapable of distinguishing between gifts and theft. He spoke of guardianship as though it were an act of mercy, as though stripping me of independence were a kindness rather than a theft. I sat still, my hands clasped in my lap, listening as he twisted moments from my life into weapons. He mentioned a time I had forgotten an appointment, another time I had misplaced my keys, each ordinary slip of life inflated into evidence of decline. Every sentence was designed to chip away at my credibility, to build a narrative of frailty, and I could see the way some of the faces in the courtroom nodded along, already half convinced. But then it was Miss Parker's turn, and she rose with a calm strength that made me proud to have chosen her. She laid the receipt on the table before the judge, her voice steady as she explained the history of the purchase, the years of payments, the jeweller's meticulous records. She reminded the court that age alone is not evidence of incompetence, that memory lapses do not equal incapacity, and that I had been managing my life and finances without issue until my son and his wife began their campaign. She called Mr. Kaplan to the stand, and when he spoke, the room shifted. His testimony was simple, direct, and undeniable. He remembered me, remembered the payments, remembered my insistence that everything be recorded properly. His voice carried the weight of impartial truth, and for the first time I saw my daughter-in-law's smirk falter. Yet the escalation did not stop there. Their lawyer, frustrated, shifted tactics. He suggested that even if the necklace had once been mine, I had gifted it willingly, and now, in a state of confusion, I was retracting the gift. He questioned Mr. Kaplan's memory, insinuating that a man of his age could not be relied upon to recall details from decades ago. Then he turned his gaze on me, asking sharp, leading questions, meant to trap me into contradictions. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, "have you ever forgotten where you placed your wallet? Have you ever repeated yourself in conversation?" Have you ever confused dates or names? I answered calmly, refusing to be rattled, acknowledging that I, like any human being, was imperfect, but never conceding to the narrative of incompetence. Each time he tried to corner me, I drew strength from the knowledge that my truth was steady, anchored by evidence and memory both. Still, the strain was enormous. Each question felt like a blade pressed against my throat, each insinuation like a shadow cast over my character. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my hands trembling slightly beneath the table, but I did not break. Miss Parker pressed on, introducing the stack of bills and records I had brought, showing the judge that my life was in order, that I managed my affairs responsibly, that their accusations were built not on fact, but on greed. The more evidence she presented, the more their facade began to crack. I saw my son shift uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting toward the judge, his confidence faltering as the lies unraveled. The escalation reached its peak when my daughter-in-law herself was called to speak. She took the stand with practiced poise, her hand resting lightly on the necklace as though drawing strength from it, and she told the story they had rehearsed. How I had allegedly placed the necklace in her hands, how I had supposedly spoken of, blessing their marriage, how I had smiled as I let go of it. But when Ms. Parker cross-examined her, pressing her on dates and details, her confidence began to waver. She could not recall the exact words I had used. She stumbled over the timeline. She grew defensive when asked why there were photographs of her wearing the necklace online before she claimed I had given it to her. The courtroom watched as her polished story frayed at the edges, and though she tried to maintain composure, the unease in her voice betrayed her. By the time the hearing ended, no decision had been reached yet, but the balance of power had shifted. What had begun as their attempt to brand me incompetent had turned into a stage where their lies were exposed, their motives questioned. I walked out of the courtroom exhausted but upright, my head held high despite the storm still raging. They had escalated the fight by dragging me into public, by trying to shame me into silence, but instead they had given me a platform to speak, to present evidence, to show the world that I was not broken. And though the battle was far from over, I could feel the tide beginning to turn. The escalation had cut deep, but it had also revealed cracks in their armor, and I knew that if I kept pressing forward, the truth would shine through. That night, back at my kitchen table, I laid the court papers beside my notebook and added new entries, documenting every detail of the hearing, every word spoken, every shift in their expressions. I knew this was only the beginning, that more hearings and more attacks would follow, but I also knew that I had endured the worst of their assault and had not faltered. They wanted to bury me under accusations, but instead I had risen in the light of their own lies. And as I closed the notebook and whispered a prayer for strength, I felt not only anger, but resolve. They had underestimated me, mistaking age for weakness, silence for surrender. But I was still here, still fighting, still unbroken. When the final day of the hearing arrived, the courthouse seemed to hum with anticipation, as though even the walls understood that something decisive was about to unfold. I had slept little the night before, rising before dawn to pray in the silence of my kitchen, my hands resting on the worn surface of the table where I had mapped out every detail of my defense. The receipt lay in its envelope beside me, but now it was more than a piece of paper. It had become a lifeline, a tangible embodiment of truth that no amount of lies could erase. My lawyer had told me that the judge would want to hear closing arguments and examine the evidence one final time before making a ruling. And I felt the gravity of that knowledge pressing against me as I dressed in the same navy dress, determined to show consistency, to remind them all that I was not a woman who wavered with the wind. The courtroom was fuller than before, with curious onlookers and members of the press scattered among the benches. Word had spread about the case, about a son attempting to strip his mother of her independence and seize a necklace worth millions. I could feel the whispers ripple through the room as I entered, but instead of shame, I felt a strange surge of strength. Let them see me, I thought. Let them watch. If they want a spectacle, I will give them the truth laid bare, and the truth has nothing to fear from light. My son sat at the table with his wife, both dressed sharply, as if they were the picture of responsibility. She wore the necklace again, her chin lifted proudly, as though daring me to crumble at the sight of it. But what she did not know was that the sight of her wearing it no longer made me feel powerless. Instead, it filled me with determination, because every sparkle on her neck was a reminder that lies shine only until they are exposed to scrutiny. Their lawyer stood first, delivering a polished speech about love, care, and guardianship, painting them as the dutiful children trying to protect a fragile elder from her own confusion. He spoke with conviction, but the cracks were beginning to show, his arguments echoing too much like rehearsed performances rather than truths born of lived reality. Then Miss Parker rose, her voice calm but commanding, and began to weave together the threads of our case. She spoke of my years of independence, of the meticulous records I had kept, of the testimony of Mr. Kaplan, who had remembered each payment and each insistence on detail. She pointed to the photographs posted online that contradicted their timeline, to the inconsistencies in my daughter-in-law's testimony, to the very arrogance that had led them to flaunt stolen goods in public. And then she placed the original receipt in front of the judge, her hand steady, her voice unwavering as she said, "This is not merely a record of purchase. This is a record of sacrifice, of labor, of a woman who earned what she owned and has the right to decide what happens to it. To dismiss this would not only be an injustice to her, but to every elder whose voice has been silenced by those claiming to act in their best interest." The room grew still as the judge lifted the receipt, examining it carefully. The silence, stretching long enough for every breath to feel amplified. My son's lawyer tried to object, claiming that the paper was old, that memory was unreliable, that perhaps the intent behind the purchase had changed over time. But before he could continue, the judge raised a hand to silence him. He turned his gaze toward me, and in that moment I felt the weight of his scrutiny, the kind that sought not only facts, but also conviction. "Mrs. Johnson," he said, "in your own words, tell this court why this necklace matters." I stood slowly, my knees trembling but my back straight, and I faced not only the judge, but the entire room. I spoke not in the clipped sentences my lawyer had advised, but in the flowing cadence of memory, of truth carried in the marrow of my bones. I told them of the years I had worked extra shifts, of the nights I had gone without so that I could make the payments, of the moment I had finally held it in my hands and knew that it represented more than jewelry. I told them that it was a symbol of dignity, of independence, of a promise to myself that I was more than labor, more than survival, that I had a right to beauty and worth. My voice trembled at times, but I pressed on, speaking not only to the judge, but to the younger women in the room, to the reporters who would carry this story, to my granddaughter whose future understanding of me would be shaped by these words. I ended simply, "This necklace is mine, and so is my story. I will not allow either to be stolen." When I sat down, the silence was profound, the kind of silence that comes when people are holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable break. The judge set the receipt back on the table, his face unreadable, and then turned his gaze toward my son and his wife. He asked them to rise, and when they did, the veneer of confidence seemed to slip just slightly. their eyes darting nervously. He questioned them about the contradictions in their testimony, about the photographs, about the timeline that had unraveled under scrutiny. Each answer they gave only deepened the cracks, exposing the desperation beneath their polished exterior. My daughter-in-law's voice grew sharp, defensive, her smirk long gone, and my son's words stumbled, betraying the certainty he had clung to. Finally, the judge leaned back and spoke with a gravity that filled the room. He declared that the petition for guardianship was unfounded, that there was no evidence to suggest I was incapable of managing my life, and that the necklace, supported by documentation and testimony, was undeniably mine. He ordered that it be returned immediately, his voice cutting through their protests with finality. The gasp that rippled through the courtroom was almost audible, a collective recognition that the truth had triumphed over the carefully constructed lies. I felt tears burn my eyes, not of weakness, but of vindication. My son's wife unclasped the necklace reluctantly, her hands trembling now where once they had been so bold, and the bailiff carried it across the room to place it in my hands. The weight of it settled against my palm, familiar and steady, and I lifted it to my throat where it belonged, fastening it once more as though reclaiming not just jewelry, but every piece of dignity they had tried to strip from me. The courtroom erupted into murmurs, the reporters scribbling notes furiously, the onlookers whispering about what they had just witnessed. My son would not meet my eyes, his head bowed, while his wife glared at me with a fury that could no longer hide her defeat. But none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was that I had stood in the light of their lies and refused to bow. I had spoken my truth, and it had been heard. As I walked out of the courthouse, the necklace warm against my skin, I felt the weight of the storm lift. The battle had not only been for me, but for every elder who had been silenced, for every woman whose sacrifices had been dismissed, for every voice that had been told it was too old to matter. The climax had come, and I had emerged not broken, but whole, holding the proof that truth, once spoken, cannot be stolen. When I woke the morning after the ruling, sunlight streamed through my bedroom window in a way that felt different, brighter, as if even the day itself recognized the weight that had been lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in months, I did not wake with the taste of dread in my mouth or the tightness of fear in my chest. Instead, I lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet, allowing myself to feel the simple peace of being in my own home, unburdened by the constant suspicion that someone was plotting to erase me. The necklace rested on the nightstand, glinting faintly in the soft light, and as I reached for it, I felt not only its familiar weight, but also the strength of everything it had come to symbolize. It was no longer merely a piece of jewelry. It was the proof of survival, the reminder that I had endured the storm and emerged not broken, but stronger than before. The days that followed brought a strange mixture of relief and reflection. Neighbors who had once avoided my eyes stopped me on the sidewalk to say they had followed the case in the news, that they were proud of me, that I had shown a courage many of them wished they could find in themselves. At church the following Sunday, women my age and older embraced me with tears in their eyes, whispering that my victory was their victory too, that I had spoken for all of them who had been silenced, dismissed, or made to feel invisible. Even younger women came to me, some barely in their 30s, saying that watching me stand up in court had given them hope that when the world tried to strip them of their dignity, they could fight back as well. For once, I was not just enduring quietly. I had become a voice, however small, in a chorus that stretched beyond my own story. But alongside the relief came the ache of betrayal that could not be so easily washed away. My son did not call. He did not come by the house. When I saw him briefly on the courthouse steps after the judgment, his eyes slid past me as though I were a stranger. I told myself I should not expect anything more, that love twisted by greed becomes something unrecognizable. But late at night, I still felt the sting of it. I thought of the boy he once was, of the laughter we once shared, of the countless sacrifices I had made for him, and I wondered if somewhere deep inside him, the man he had become would ever regret what he had tried to do. Perhaps he never would. Perhaps that part of him was gone for good, but I no longer felt that his choices defined me. For too long, I had measured my worth by his love and approval. Now I measured it by my ability to stand tall, even when the people closest to me turned against me. There were practical matters to address in the aftermath, with Miss Parker's guidance. I met with a financial advisor and secured my accounts so that no one else could gain access to them. I updated my will, making clear that my granddaughter would one day inherit the necklace under terms I set, not terms anyone else imposed. I locked away copies of the court judgment alongside the receipt, ensuring that the evidence of what had transpired would never vanish. It felt strange to live with this new vigilance, but it also felt empowering. I was no longer a woman waiting for the next betrayal. I was a woman taking steps to protect herself, her legacy, and her story. One evening, as I prepared dinner alone, I set the necklace around my throat once more, letting it rest against my skin as I stirred the pot on the stove. I caught my reflection in the window, the diamonds glinting in the fading light, and I thought of my mother's words. Never let anyone tell you that you cannot own something fine. I smiled, not just because I had reclaimed the necklace, but because I had reclaimed the part of myself that believed I was worthy of more than survival. I was worthy of respect, of beauty, of dignity. That truth was mine to carry, no matter what others tried to do. The story did not end with trumpets or celebrations. Life returned to its quiet rhythm, punctuated by church services, phone calls with friends, and afternoons in the garden. But beneath the ordinary, something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer afraid of being erased. I had faced the attempt head-on, and I had won. And though the pain of betrayal lingered, it no longer controlled me. Instead, it reminded me that even in the darkest moments, even when the people you love most turn against you, you still have the power to define yourself, to speak your truth, to insist on being seen. Weeks later, a local newspaper ran a short article about the case, framing it as a story of elder justice, of a woman who refused to be silenced. They quoted Miss Parker, who spoke about the importance of protecting elders from exploitation, and they mentioned my name with respect. I cut the article out and placed it in the cedar chest with the receipt and the judgment, not out of vanity, but as a record, a reminder for future generations that our voices matter, that our stories deserve to be preserved. I imagined my granddaughter one day opening that chest, finding not only a necklace, but also the paper trail of a battle fought and won, and understanding that strength runs in her blood. As I sat on my porch one evening, the sun setting in streaks of gold and crimson across the sky, I felt a peace I had not known in years. The world was still uncertain. My son was still lost to me. But I was whole. I had not only reclaimed my necklace, I had reclaimed my dignity, my independence, and my voice. And in that quiet moment, watching the day fade into night, I knew that was the true inheritance I would leave behind.